Hi everyone, welcome to the next chapter of my system. This time we're going to look at chapter 9, which is an interesting chapter because the issue of the pawn chain is not something that is discussed elsewhere as often as the other elements in my system, such as, the center, open files, the pin, and other tactical ideas. So what exactly is meant by the expression pawn chain? Let's make an example of the French defense. So e4, e6, d4, d5, e5. Here we have created what Nimzowitsch initially calls a black-white pawn chain, and later in the chapter shortens simply to pawn chain. Here the 4 pawns that have moved constitute the links in the pawn chain. So these 4 pawns here, of course. d4 is the base of the white chain, whilst e6 and not f7 is the base of the black chain. The base is always the bottom link of the chain, and the reason it's not f7 is because f7 doesn't have a white pawn, well, it's not facing a white pawn on f6, so it's still mobile. And the base is always the bottom link of the chain, and every pawn chain such as this one, with pawns of opposite colors meshed together diagonally, regardless of how many pawns it involves or where it is on the board, divides the board into 2 sections. So Nimzowitsch then gives 2 further illustrative examples. This one, it's another complete pawn chain, and this one. So it's a fairly simple idea, but there's a lot of complicated ideas going on with it that we'll go into now. But before exploring further what Nimzowitsch mentions on the ideas behind building a chain, he advises looking over the earlier chapters on open files, and also the blockade and the pass pawn, as a thorough understanding will be crucial for the correct comprehension of what follows here. For example, if we go back to the French defense opening from before, so e4, e6, d4, d5, and now let's take a look at what is happening here. Nimzowicz's observation was that for as long as the e4 pawn does not advance, white has the possibility of opening the e-file with e takes d5 in order to begin what should be a lasting operation down the e-file. Moves like a later knight e5 are an obvious idea. But if he plays e5 at any moment, he immediately loses that possibility, as well as releasing the tension in the center and the pressure on his opponent for no apparent reason. So, what are his reasons for doing this? Surely all of the energy that was waiting to come out of the white position does not simply disappear after he plays this move. Of course, it's still there, but it has been modified. Above all, this setup blocks the movement of the black pawns and also avoids the freeing of the bad French bishop that follows if white elects the e takes d5 line, because then will come e takes d5, and this bishop, which had been trapped by this pawn, is now completely free. Playing e5 is similar to a blockade due to the fact that it hinders black if he wants to advance in the center, which he will almost always want to do. Pawns in the center contained a huge desire to expand, at least as Nimzowitsch saw it, and thus to prevent this expansion is to inflict a degree of disadvantage on our opponent. On top of that, this move e5 creates 2 clear battlegrounds, the black king side and the center. So let's say play continues from here to this position. White has done well and he's up in material, but the important thing to note is that the pawn chain is still intact in the center. Should black play something like f5 here in order to establish lines of communication along his second rank, the e5 pawn will remain an excellent wedge by exercising a considerable influence on any attempts to reunite black's isolated king side with the rest of his pieces. This remains true if it's played during the opening phase of the French. Also, this cramping effect that the e5 pawn will have. And white also has the attractive option of e takes f6, and after rook takes f6, white can create play on the e file. He can attack this backward pawn on e6, and he can use this outpost on e5 moves like rook e1, knight e5, or bishop f4, e5, and so on. And yeah, the e6 pressure on this pawn is going to be substantial, especially considering it can't advance because white's going to bind on e5. And it's important to note that in this example and in the opening stages, if white had had a pawn on f4, it would have been a very disruptive influence due to the fact that it would hinder not only the dark squared bishop but also any pieces that might want to use the f4 square as a springboard for active play. And these factors would definitely outweigh any positive ideas in the f4 pawn push that many players of the French defense still play, with the idea of, you know, pushing to f5, which is a kind of standard idea once such a pawn chain as this, you know, the opening stages of the French defense has been established. The point is that black's pawn is fixed on e6 in that pawn chain, and therefore it becomes a target, and playing f4, f5 is the logical way to attack it. And if black plays e takes f5, then he's surrendered the base of his chain and ergo made a mistake. White can also continue by advancing the pawn to f6 once it gets to f5, or he can capture on e6 in order to open the f file with the aims of infiltrating to f7 with the rook and moving along the second rank, or just occupying the second rank. So to be able to better understand the connections here, it's necessary to look more closely at the very nucleus of the side or flanking attack. So the important thing to look at here is the rooks and how they're attacking the black pawns. The position of the kings and the material is irrelevant. So let's look at them as, two separate examples. In this first case, on the left, the pawn is quite simply under attack from the rook, and specifically under frontal attack. It's being attacked from the front. In this example here on the right, a frontal attack is impossible because of the f5 pawn. So the method of attack will be rook g6 and taking on f6 or something similar. So, it's all very simple stuff, but Nimzowitsch felt it was important to emphasize the fact that the f5 pawn is not only an element but a logically forced element in the side or flanking attack. I.e., if there was no pawn on f5, a frontal attack on f6 would be possible, which would be simpler. Moreover, were there no pawn on f5, then f6 would not be fixed. And this is important too, because the object of attack must always be first rendered immobile. These ideas can be understood on a deeper level by looking at the next diagram. So here we have the same structure that we've seen in previous examples with the d4, e5, d5, e6 pawn chain, and both players are attacking the base of their opponent's chains. White is on e6 and black is on d4. The rooks are lurking and ready to come into action at the right moment. Both players have also done the necessary preliminary work that they need to in order to attack with a clear conscience, i.e. they have fixed their objects of attack. The d4 and e6 pawns cannot advance. So through creating a pawn chain by pushing to e5 and then continuing with f4, f5, white has created an attack on the e6 pawn, which becomes the center of his attack and a battlefield as a result. After this section, Nimzowitsch again stresses that the important element in pawn chains is prophylaxis, i.e. whether or not the players are restraining each other from advancing, which is obviously a desirable thing to be doing. It doesn't matter if our own pawns are doing this on their own or with the help of stronger pieces. The most important thing is that the restraint exists against the enemy pawns. Also, he goes on to say that attacking the base of our opponent's pawn chain is a strategical necessity and must be done as soon as possible. After we have taken out the base, we can move on to the next pawn in the chain. For example, e4, e6, d4, d5, e5. And you know, here it's clear that black's central pawns are being restrained by the white central pawns, which are more advanced and can therefore claim to be the ones doing the restraining. Therefore, black should attack the base immediately with c5 as opposed to f6, because the d4 pawn is the base and the e5 pawn is, in Nimzowicz's words, an architectural ornament. He likens it to undermining a construction and points out that if we were doing so, we would of course have more success if we focused on the foundations rather than the rooftops, which will collapse once the foundations are taken out in any case. After c5, white has several possibilities, c3 being the most logical and popular. But the purpose of black's plan can be felt the keenest if white plays naively and with no understanding of how pawn chains should work. For example, if he plays d takes c5, and after b takes c5, knight c3, black could answer f6. Now that the foundations have been taken out, i.e. the d4 pawn, he can turn his attention to the ornamental e5 pawn, the next step up the chain. And when he's done, he will have a dangerously mobile pawn center, which will give white some headaches for sure. Let's say he continues here with e takes f6, another naive move. Now will come knight takes f6, and let's say knight f3, knight c6, bishop d3, and now e5. And already black is starting to gain a good advantage in the position. Of course, this is due to white's inferior play. Usually it would take maybe 20 or 25 moves for black to liberate his position in such a way in the French defense, and you know, simultaneously have to be putting up with much more aggressive play from white. And obviously therefore he would have to go through much greater pains in order to secure this kind of mobility and liberty. And it's important to note that it's only through eliminating the white pawn chain that it became possible for black to advance in this way. Also, this advance e5, which liberates the bad French bishop on c8, and further pawn advances were the ultimate goal when black played c5 on the third move of the game in order to undermine the restraint that the white pawns were exerting on the black ones. It's not surprising that once such restrained and frustrated pawns become mobile, they have a particularly warlike spirit, at least as Nimzowitsch saw it, because they're taking revenge for the humiliation that they suffered. Okay, so in this diagram, the c3 pawn is the base of white's pawn chain, and as I said, it's not the b2 pawn because there's no black pawn on b3, and so the b2 pawn is neither part of the pawn chain proper or restricted in its movement. Ignoring the kings, the correct way for black to proceed is with b5 to b4 and taking on c3, if permitted, which would create a weak and fixed target on c3 to attack. In many instances there would of course be several more pieces in play here. If white plays c takes b4, then he creates a different weakness for himself in the d4 pawn, which similarly will be weak as it can no longer be protected by a pawn and is at the bottom of the pawn chain. This often brings about what Nimzowitsch refers to as a strict siege, which we'll look at more closely later. Of course, black does not want to challenge the white pawns by playing f6 instead, because even if he plays f takes e5, the white pawn chain remains intact after d takes e5, and black cannot make meaningful progress. This is why b5 and b4 is better. At this point, Nimzowitsch gives what he calls a true definition of how things stand with regard to pawn chains such as these. In the realm of pawn chains, the struggle for freedom is identical to the struggle against a blockading piece that is causing us grief, and for that reason the problem can be reduced to a blockading problem, i.e. the most significant element of a pawn chain is their blockading effect with regard to making progress on the board. So, in chapter 4, which looked at the blockade more closely, we studied the idea of the exchange maneuver, i.e. to exchange off our opponent's blockading piece so that they must replace it with a less effective or somehow weaker blockading piece. It became clear in that chapter that any piece that is stopping an otherwise mobile pawn should be considered a blockader. Yet it still comes as a surprise that after e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, we can consider the pawns on d4 and e5 as blockaders, because this role is more often reserved for stronger pieces. Indeed, by definition, when we talk about a blockade, we expect to see one of the officers setting up the blockade. But the point is that these white pawns are restricting the black pawns, and as such share a lot in common with the more usual blockades. Nimzowitsch says here that we should consider pawns in a chain to be of a higher order than standard pawns, as they function in a considerably different way, and their blockading effect gives them a higher value than bog standard pawns. It's important to keep that in mind as we now consider the principle of exchanging off the blockading piece when applied to pawn chains. As I said before, it's only ever justifiable to exchange off a blockading piece if the replacement blockader is a weaker piece than its predecessor. The same is also true of pawn chains. Let's say, for example, play continues here with c5, now knight c3. After this suboptimal move, black can replace the blockading pawn on d4 with the white queen. After c takes d4, queen takes d4, and now gain a tempo with knight c6, proving, firstly, that the queen is a blockader that's hard to maintain, and secondly, that black was correct to initiate the exchange on d4, even after bishop b5, because black can play bishop d7, and after the almost forced bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, black already has a slight edge due to his central pawn majority, which is reasonably mobile, and the bishop pair. But in this example, white played in a suboptimal way. Now let's see what happens if black gets it wrong. So we'll have the same first few moves. c5. And now let's say white plays bishop e3. It now becomes clear that after knight c6, knight c3, c takes d4, bishop takes d4, the bishop is a very tough nut to crack, and thus a strong blockader. So black would have been wrong to initiate the exchange on d4. Even in winning the bishop pair, by knight takes d4, queen takes d4, now knight e7, white can play knight f3, and after knight c6 he can play queen f4. And you know, black has succeeded in driving away the blockading troops, but it has come at considerable cost, due to the black knight having to move twice to chase the queen away, and in any case, white is now well placed for a kingside attack, even if black follows up with f6 to take over the center pawns completely. Now might come bishop b5, a6, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and white can just castle. And from here, black will never manage to make his e6 pawn mobile, so white has nothing to worry about. If f takes e5 is ever played, white will answer with knight takes e5 and have the use of this excellent square e5, and as long as he retains that positional hold, he has a claim to an advantage in the position. So Nimzowitsch felt that this should bring us closer to an understanding of pawn chains. All exchanges in this area take place with the single intention of replacing strong blockaders with weaker ones, and it's well worth looking over chapter 4 again to refresh our understanding of the blockade and how it relates to what we've looked at here. Of course, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to whether or not a piece is a strong or weak one as a blockader, and we must judge on a case-by-case basis using the insight that Nimzowitsch has given us. Naturally, the ability to judge such things will be of huge importance to our success over the board, and it's something that can be developed through experience as well as sensed through instinct. So let's have a look at a quick example. Okay, so taking into account what we've looked at just now, what should white play here? If you want to have a closer look, then stop the video now. Nimzowitsch was a positional player and, as a result, was inclined to favor positional play over materially minded ideas. The move he gave as tempting to the beginner, but ultimately a mistake, was queen c2. White has a threat of bishop takes f6 and then bishop takes h7, winning a pawn, but this idea ignores the positional components of the game, in particular white's blockading piece on e5. After, for example, castling, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes h7 check, king h8, bishop d3, e5, white may have won a pawn, but he's lost his positional grip and allowed the black center to become mobile, which is more significant than simply winning a pawn. Black has overcome the blockade, and his central pawn march will carry very strong force behind it. So instead of playing queen c2 at this stage, what white should play is knight d2. And this is going to back up his blockade on the e5 square. Because now, after castling, he can play knight f3. And here he retains his positional grip and he keeps black restricted, which is much better than simply winning a pawn and letting his entire position go down the drain. Once again, we learn here that positional considerations are far more important than material ones. Let's say black continues now with bishop d6 to try and break down the blockade. Now comes queen c2. And not something like bishop d4 intending rook e1 or queen e2 next. If black plays queen c7 to challenge control of e5 and try and advance at e5 and liberate his position. For example, queen c7, queen e2, because now black can play knight g4 and e5 on the next move. Even if h3 now, e5, and black is starting to gain an edge in all lines. So it's important to get the move order right, so that to ensure that white can play knight e5 when he wants to. And white does this through playing queen e2 or any other move that takes further control of e5 instead of the time-wasting bishop d4. So here, he played queen e2. So how does black continue now? He could play, for example, rook a c8, and now white can safely play bishop d4 because he has e5 under control. If now queen c7, knight e5, and it will take black an awful long time to break down the blockade and free his game with the e5 push. So we'll look at some similar real game examples from some of Nimzowicz's over the board play in a moment. Okay, we'll do this video in two parts, so that's the end of part 1.